Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think I'll be informed by the chat if people can't hear me, but I also welcome each of our panelists. We've got David Hill, Paul Thomas, and Kirrilly McKenzie here. Apologies from Dr. Michelle Collar. She's come down quite ill today. She's got 2 sick children to care for as well, which I'm sure hasn't helped her. But Paul has quite ably come in to fill the breach, and we're very grateful for him for that. We think we're going to have a really interesting discussion today. We've had a much greater influx of interest in the event than we first imagined, but we think we're up for it. So at the moment, we've got this broadcasting on Zoom for everyone in the chat at the moment, and also on YouTube. Feel free to ask questions as we go, and I'll look to give them to the panelists as we progress along. But to start us off, each of the panelists will have a short period of time just to give their thoughts on the topic of the declining study of Indonesian in Australian universities. I think we're going to touch on a couple of other topics which are connected to that. So I think it's going to be really interesting. But I want to pass over to David Hill first, because he's written a recent article about this, which I think really sets the foundations for where we are at the moment in terms of the study of Indonesian. So I'll toss it over to you, David.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Can everybody hear me? Great, thank you. Look, first of all, I want to thank AIYA for arranging this event, giving an opportunity for those of us from around the country and from Indonesia to consider what is, in my view, a really grave and tragic situation, and that is the decades of decline in enrolment in Indonesian language studies in Australian universities. I want to say from the outset that I'm very conscious of the fact that participating in our conversation today are many individuals who have a much greater experience of this than I do, including a number who've had a much longer association with the teaching of Indonesian and Indonesian studies more generally in Australian universities. I'm thinking of people like Professor Colin Brown, George Quinn, I'm conscious Greg Feely, Dirk Thomsa, Annie Polman, Julian Milley. A lot of people around this conversation have been extraordinarily active, both in their own state and beyond that, nationally and internationally. And I want to acknowledge that and to say I'm looking forward to their input into our conversation. Dan referred to an article that I had in the Asian Studies online journal or newsletter, Asian Currents, in which I attempted to do an overview of how Indonesian enrolments in unis had been going over the last 20 years. And I suppose the key things I'd like to draw out of that are as follows. Firstly, that we had a peak in the early 1990s when interest was at its highest in Australia. That has been steadily slipping away to a point where now we have, in effect, fewer people in Australian universities studying Indonesian than we had in 1992. Despite the fact that there are now 3 times the number of students in our universities in Australia than there were those several decades ago, the number who are selecting Indonesian is less than half. And that really, I think, is a cause for grave concern. Without going into too much detail, there have been a number of studies of this over the years. Key factors have been national policy to identify Indonesian as a language of national priority, particularly the Hawke Labor government's adoption in 1987 of a national policy on languages, which spun into various states, all states in fact, and territories, nominating Indonesian as a priority language. Enrollments, and I should just digress and say enrollments in Australian universities are measured by a strange calculation known as the equivalent full-time student load. So essentially, this is the total load carried by an undergraduate student across a full year in all subjects is regarded as one FTL, one equivalent full-time student load. If a student, for example, was able to study Indonesian every class through their year at university, that would equal one FTL. In fact, that's really usually several dozen students make up that one FTL. And at its peak, we had about 500 FTLs worth of students. So probably, some 2,000 odd students studying Indonesian in Australian universities. Now we have under 200. So we've dropped away by a major proportion. I won't go into the details of how that's calculated. If you're interested, as I say, I can provide details of that article. But essentially what happened was from the early 90s, numbers started to fall off. They plateaued at about 2009 through to 2014. And then they've started dropping again since then. And we now have also fewer universities teaching Indonesian than we had in 1992, despite the fact that we have a very strong tertiary education sector. So given all of that, is there any reason for any optimism? And I would point to a couple of things. I would say that this is a very patchy, in reality, there are certain positive elements in this. For example, one university in Victoria actually increased its student enrolments between 2014 and 2019, only by a very small amount. In New South Wales, over that 5-year period, the most recent 5 years, the numbers have been fairly level, so that state is no longer kind of dropping. The other thing I would say that's probably relevant to our national discussion here today is that Victoria as a state is teaching the largest chunk of our tertiary students of Indonesian language. About 45% of the nation's enrolments in Indonesian are in universities in Victoria. And albeit the overall numbers have declined as a proportion, that's still a very significant proportion. Without wanting to labour the point, let me just conclude, or in this last minute or so, just mention the really big game changer here. If I've been talking about this decline over more than 20 years of enrolments, I want to mention the impact of the new Colombo plan. And I imagine most of you would be aware of the fact that the federal government makes available funding to Australian students to go to Asia and the Pacific to undertake studies there, including particularly language studies. And that's had a very substantial stimulus in the number of students going to Indonesia to study. In 2017, more than 1,100 undergraduates went to Indonesia for some kind of study experience, in many cases very short study tours. But 2018, about 40 spent a semester or longer studying Indonesian language specifically through the consortium known as the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies, ACICIS. And by way of declaration, I was involved in setting that up for a number of years. And though I stepped down from that position several years ago, I still have an interest in that and sit on the national board. But AIYA as an entity, and it's a collection of 25 universities, all of whom feed their students into common study programs in Indonesia. I think it's worth noting that in 2018, the total student enrolment load of AIYA, which was in round figures over 30 FTL, was actually the largest agglomeration of FTL, of student load, in Australia, with the exception of one individual university. Only one Australian university actually taught a larger student load than actually were undertaking studies in Indonesia through AIYA. And only 2 states had larger FTL load than did AIYA. So the idea of students actually studying Indonesian in Indonesia and crediting that back to their Australian university is now actually a very significant component of our overall national study pattern in Australia. And it's likely to stay that way. Now, I can't finish without giving a plug for the fact that, having just said that, AIYA itself is in fact under threat because student enrolments completely fell away this year. There'll be no students studying with AIYA for the rest of this year, I suspect. And the consortium is actually, the alumni are currently running an alumni fundraising campaign. And I would urge all of you involved, should you be in a position to do so, to seek out ways of assisting AIYA in that regard. But let me just conclude by saying then we've seen a pattern of decline in conventional learning strategies for Indonesian and Australia. We've seen this growth in in-country study nationally, dispersed through the AIYA model. There was a stabilisation until recently in the numbers studying Indonesian, but again, we're now, if you like, back to where we were in the early 1990s. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Many interesting points, and in-country studies is definitely a topic which we're going to circle back to. You mentioned in there how great Victoria is doing in comparison to the other states, and we have a secondary school teacher from Victoria in Kirrilly, McKenzie. So this is where I might bring you in, Kirrilly. Please give us your thoughts on the situation as you see it.
Okay, hopefully there's no backlash this time. I should emphasize that I've also had quite a hectic day. I had to take a woodwork class today, and so my mind is a little bit bonkers today, but chasing kids with hammers. Okay, so I just want to thank AIYA for this opportunity, and it's really great to see everyone's interest in this. I'd like to take the opportunity to kind of contextualize what's happening in Indonesian language programs in schools, because I think that schools set up university programs. And I also want to talk about the stigma around Indonesian language programs in schools. So as a preface, my experiences have been predominantly within the ACT system, and I've only just joined the Victorian public education system this year. So people may have different experiences around Australia. Also, I was hoping that Michelle would, contextualize all of those big data things as well. So in the context of schools, I think it's really important to know a few things about what's happening in with Indonesian programs in schools. And the school curriculum is jammed-packed. Schools have to have music programs, art programs, literacy programs. They're expected to have numeracy levels and all of those kinds of things. And this is especially amplified in year 11 and 12 students whose subjects, they'll choose subjects which boost their ATAR, or they have to study certain subjects to enter medicine programs or certain courses at university. So often Indonesian falls off quite quickly. Indonesian programs in primary and secondary schools are usually with a maximum 1 to 3 Indonesian teachers. So the fight for greater resources, time to teach Indonesian, a classroom, et cetera, is extremely emotionally taxing and time consuming. We're also continually selling our classes and advertising our classes, which other subjects don't have to do. And that's really, really taxing on teachers. Languages are generally only compulsory until year 8. Then languages become a part of the elective stream. So languages are competing with creative subjects like art, woodwork, metalwork, outdoor education, all of those kinds of fun subjects that Indonesian is not necessarily seen as, but it should be, of course. Schools can be deterred by a lack of Indonesian teachers. This was definitely my experience in Canberra. I haven't seen that as much in Victoria, but it definitely was a problem in Canberra, although there was a rise in the number of schools that were teaching Indonesian in Canberra. I can see Elise here, their whole school is dropped all of their French, German programs and put in wholly Indonesian. So that's a really positive step as well. But for the most part, schools can be deterred by the lack of availability of Indonesian teachers. Indonesian classes are often determined by teachers who don't understand language learning or particularly Indonesian. A really crucial part to understand is also that languages are offered in primary school for as little as 30 minutes a week. So this already can be, our primary school teachers are amazing, but this can already be a deterrent to further language study down the line. Particularly as Indonesian is one of the most popular languages taught in primary school. So I think this is a really important fact. And I think that primary schools set up secondary schools, which set up universities. So schools also have to take a risk on small class sizes. I was just talking with my high school teacher yesterday, and she was telling me about when I was in high school, how there were 5 of us and there was a lot of pressure for the school to shut down the Indonesian program. But luckily they didn't, because it's actually very expensive for schools to keep open programs with really small numbers. There's also lots of competition with other languages in bigger schools. So Japanese is very on trend, Korean is very on trend, Chinese get a lot of money, French is just, I don't know why, but it's cool. So kids tend to choose those other languages. This all leads on to my second point, which is about destigmatizing Indonesian in schools. And I think that Indonesian specifically, more so than other languages, has to be destigmatized. And I think I actually am quite optimistic about the possibility of this. So in a study by Dr. Phil Roberts a few years ago of the New South Wales HSC, of the hierarchy of curriculum, Indonesian was way up the top. So Indonesian, it was only a few years ago, was studied by a small amount of students from a very high socioeconomic background. And I think that this demonstrates the inaccessibility of Indonesian in schools as we go further up through the higher years of schools. I wanted to know, when I first came into Indonesian teaching, how to motivate students. And I saw through conversations that this had to be approached from the whole school. So I did a survey of students, parents, and staff, and the students and parents were extremely supportive of learning Indonesian, and kids were actually really excited about learning Indonesian. This is an inner city public school in Canberra, so I should preface that wouldn't be around the country. But the results were particularly frightening when it came to the whole school, the staff of the school. And so despite having an exceptionally supportive principal, staff on the whole were not particularly supportive of the Indonesian program. Some admitting they did not encourage students to learn Indonesian at all. Staff did not see Indonesian as for all students, and they oftentimes had extremely negative views about Indonesia. Staff widely didn't understand what was being taught in language classes. Aside from the health benefits, they had little understanding of the impact of language learning on empathy, social skills, but really important to schools, literacy. And students with low literacy or special needs are often pulled out of language classes. And I think that that's a really problematic approach to language learning as well, because we can see the benefits of language learning on low literacy students particularly. I think that languages are also only seen for high achieving students in schools, and this is extremely problematic and a problem in wider Australia as well, I think. But we have to open up languages to every student. In Year 7, students are often expected to pay for really expensive textbooks, Education Perfect subscriptions before they even start the class. So this already puts off parents and some students offside before they even get into your classroom. It also further emphasises that Indonesian is seen as for the elite. And excursions are really expensive, overseas trips are really expensive, so this can further put off students. And luckily for us, we have stuff going on further through teachers and AIYA and things like that, which means that actually it's more accessible, but parents don't see that from the get-go. Languages are not put front and center in schools. Unlike other subjects like art, you see artwork all over the schools. Sporting teams represent outside school, they're in uniform. You don't see Indonesian or languages represented in the school. So signages are all in English, assemblies are conducted all in English. And I think that this is a really simple way to actually make languages visible and prioritizing languages in schools. I think, last bit, I think we have the coolest subject in schools, and for me it's a really easy sell. We have orangutan, Komodo dragons, nasi goreng, Indomie, we've got Chris Hemsworth and Barack Obama, and I always say to my kids, when in Year 6, when you're trying to get them into your Year 7 class, that if Obama cares about Indonesia, you have to care about Indonesia. I should also quickly mention Michael J is a really great equaliser and with Karen Bailey from Balai Bahasa Indonesia in Perth. It's a really great equaliser in getting kids into Indonesian. You're hearing music and being able to understand what's going on in the language of that music. So I think that Indonesian ticks off all the boxes for schools, they just don't see it. It's not a colonial language, it's gender neutral, it's a diverse language, culture, religion, it has a relationship with Indigenous Australia, it ticks all the boxes. So we actually have a great sell for Indonesian in schools. And I think that we need schools to succeed in order for our university programs to succeed, in order to build that better relationship with Indonesia. I think I've got through all of, so essentially if we can make 12-year-olds like Indonesia and love Indonesia, then maybe they'll come back to Indonesian at some later date. They might be a scientist, on the teachers program, and we just need to really emphasize to 12-year-olds that it's not about planning for your career 20 years in the future, it's just about loving and enjoying Indonesian, and that's really important. I actually read that from an article in Michelle Kohler's work. So anyway, thank you, I've talked a lot, sorry. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Kirrilly. And I hope everyone who's watching is enjoying your background, a very visible display of the wonders of Indonesia for your students and everyone else in the school. One thing that you sort of mentioned there, which kind of stunned me, was the perceptions of staff regarding Indonesia. Now, Paul, I'll confess I haven't read your entire book. I've had a quick look at the foreword, but in it says that you regard one of the language learning itself as a real critical activity for building mutual understanding, and it seems there to be that lacking understanding. What are your views on the situation? How do you see things from your vantage point? We might need you to unmute, Paul.
How about that?
There we go.
Okay, fantastic. Look, thanks very much, Dan. And I guess I should thank Clarice Campbell for dobbing me in about an hour ago. So you can call me Paul or not Michelle. And I will do my best to bring a few ideas, maybe some general strokes about the context, the cultural context in which we teach Indonesian. It was great to hear David and Kirrilly. Kirrilly, you've convinced me to teach Indonesian again. It's just, it sounds so exciting where you are. Perhaps we're continuing the dominance of the Victorian state in the teaching of Indonesian, because I'm also Victorian based. But my interests have been really looking at the history of Indonesian and Malay, how it came about, why people made the decision to teach Indonesian in our schools. And I should say that from the outset, when you look back at the history, it was clearly a culturally bold move to make. The teaching of Indonesian was always going to be a challenge in Australia because it stood outside our mainstream European and American cultural trends which have dominated. Whether we want that or not, we have to accept that in Australia today, most of our trends really come from America and Europe, and Indonesian stands outside that. This is a very much an independent move that we're making when we look at Indonesia as an Asian language, as a Pacific language. And partly because of that, I think there's been a strong emphasis on promoting Indonesian mainly from a pragmatic perspective, even though languages in Australia are studied primarily for cultural motives. This may not necessarily be at the teacher level, as we just heard from Kirrilly, but in the kind of message that parents get. So there's a bit of tension there where we want to promote the pragmatic side of Indonesian, but we know that most people, when they're studying a language, choose because of the cultural benefits. So keeping that in mind, if we look at perhaps the most recent history, that is before COVID-19 came onto the scene, I think that there was a general feeling that we were actually heading in the right direction. We know that there was a trend down in many states. My experience in 2 universities saw a decrease in staff, both at Monash and at Deakin. And so that was, weighing on my shoulders quite a lot as I came to the end of my teaching at Monash. But overall, the last 10 years have been really an interesting time. Previous to that, yes, we knew that there were problems with the teaching of Indonesian, but in the last 10 years, there was a much more active and intelligent lobbying for Indonesian. And we can see that partly through some of the studies that were undertaken by David, for example, or Philip Mencken. We had nice hard figures to start approaching, whether they be politicians or people in our schools, and give them the facts and say, this is important, this is what's happening, do you care? And people said, yes, they do care. Now, we would all like to change things very quickly, but it takes a long time to turn things around. But as I said, things were heading in the right direction, and we've got very specific things that we can look at that showed that we were heading in the right direction. For example, the new Colombo plan and its association with Achichis, as David's just gone through, that increase in numbers of Australian students going to study Indonesian in Indonesia was a very positive trend. We had the growth of AIYA, which we're here today, and thanks to AIYA for inviting me. So that was a great initiative. We tried several times to get student groups together at universities, but now we had a national organisation helping us, supporting us, and they in turn were supported also at government levels and through educational institutions. There were bridge programs, young leaders in Victoria. So a series of initiatives, concrete initiatives that are happening over the last 10 years. So I still view this last 10 years somewhat positively. What will happen with COVID? I don't know. I don't know where it's going to go. There are some real dangers. And of course, lots of people are worried about it. Going back to this idea of the cultural context of Indonesian, I like to say that, from that very beginnings of the contemporary programs in the 1950s, and in some of my articles, I've talked about previous attempts in the 1930s and the 1940s to get Indonesian Malay going. Both failed. But in the 1950s, people once again came to Indonesian because of pragmatic reasons. They knew that Indonesia was a gateway to Australia and that we were very concerned what was happening in Indonesia. People were worried during the Cold War of the influence of communism, but we're also worried about democratic progress in Indonesia. And at that time, we thought we could teach the Indonesians something. And that was a slightly unfortunate situation in the sense that we didn't really understand what Indonesia could teach us. But that was the idea, that we would teach them about democracy. We had a proud tradition here in Australia. Fortunately, when the programs got off the ground, people became quite fascinated in the culture of Indonesia, and that took a more central role. But when the universities first looked at where to put Indonesian, they didn't know exactly where to place it. They didn't put it with the other languages because it didn't fit the literature mold of teaching Indonesian. It had this association with politics and contemporary interests. So it came as a sort of default. I said, well, what Asian language can we teach? In the meetings that I read from the archives, they were sitting around saying, what Asian language can we teach in Australian schools? And they said, well, we can't teach Chinese. It's too difficult for the students. And I'm sure there are Chinese teachers which would object to that now. And they said, we can't teach Japanese because we just fought a war with the Japanese 10 years ago, and the parents are not going to accept that. And so Indonesia was considered the Asian language which was just right. But again, it was not through a growing interest in Southeast Asian culture. It was through a pragmatic decision that it was the easiest one that we could select at that time. So what I would say is that what we've got now is this challenge, and again, Kirrilly brought this up, is we've got to make Indonesian cool, and we've known that for some time, but how do we do it when it's outside our normal cultural experience? I would say it's inconceivable that Indonesian in our schools or universities would die out again. I can't see that happening. But whether it takes a central role, whether it becomes a norm that most people accept, I don't know. It's outside the perceptions of our standard or traditional education, particularly if you talk to parents and people who help our students make those decisions. But it's also part of a cultural reorientation for Australia that we've been trying to undertake almost since the Second World War. It's this long-term process that we're going through. And when Australian culture is strong, I feel we take a stronger interest in Indonesia and our neighbours. And when global trends are strong, we tend to find it difficult to compete with. If we talk to most people about Asia, they're going to think of China, Korea, and Japan. And that's because that's the way Europeans and Americans see Asia. I often got disappointed with SBS when it has its Asian pop programs, but there's no Indonesians singing on there. They have the Koreans and Japanese and Chinese because Asia, follows that trend. So I hope, that we're going to continue this process, see the importance of culture and how we're going to make Indonesian cool. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a topic that I want to stick to for a little bit, which is how to make Indonesia cool. But more broadly, how I've always viewed that issue is, what is the narrative of being Indonesian, studying Indonesian, being an Indonesianist? I feel that a lot of my friends who study other languages, whether it be Japanese or a European language, they have a very concrete idea of what that entails. Maybe they like anime, maybe they like K-pop, but there's artifacts that they can latch onto. Why did I study Indonesian? My mother's Indonesian. It was a very concrete thing which I could identify with. If we're looking to expand our audience of who's interested in Indonesian, what are some of those artifacts? And I might turn to you, David, because I've often viewed in-country programs as bringing Australian students to where the artifacts are, to Indonesia. But is there a way for us to have those artifacts here for those students and people that can't actually go to Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Dan. Thanks. And again, I think there are people with much greater experience than me who are participating today. I suppose for me, rather than, I mean, there have been various attempts to bring those artifacts in. For a long period of time, it was the gamelan, it was batik, it was these kinds of things, food, of course. And I haven't taught in schools for many, many decades and haven't taught in universities for a number of years now. I'm retired, but my sense was that one of the problems we had in trying to promote Indonesian was precisely its linkage to cultural forms which were seen as quaint, of no contemporary interest, like gamelan, like batik, like angklung. These were kind of cutesy things, but they didn't have the power of K-pop. They didn't have the kind of contemporary excitement of anime. And as a result of that, we kind of lost the race for students. And I was really interested to hear Kirrilly's reference to Michael J. and participating today, Karen Bailey from the Balai Bahasa Indonesia in Perth. I think the Michael J. phenomenon has really shown the benefit of actually making the linkages to contemporary cultural forms in Indonesia. Enormous kind of social media, popular culture, a film culture, a music culture, kind of app and development, fashion design elements that I suspect would mean an awful lot more to the vast majority of high school students and undergraduate students in Australia than do gamelan, angklung, and batik. Yeah, so can I make one comment though, Dan, about the benefit of in-country study? I mean, from my perspective, one of the great things about getting students, whether this is at high school, whether it's at university, into Indonesia, is that I believe in that process, students will find their touchstone in Indonesia. They will find what it is in Indonesia which speaks to them and makes sense to them and appeals to them. And it could be something quirky, it could be something mainstream, it could be politics, it could be ecological issues, it might be painting, it could be dance, it could be, I don't know, anything. But if we can get them in country and get them to see that, they will find their own point of linkage to contemporary Indonesia. And I think that's the trigger or at least it's a significant trigger in then providing the impetus to continue to study and to seek higher levels of communicative ability. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. And what you just said brought to mind something from Dr. Michelle Coller's notes, which she sent through before, where she says it's not about finding what's relevant to students, it's about finding what's significant to them, what makes sense to them to build that traction. You're at the coalface, Kirrilly. You can see probably on a minute-by-minute basis what's keeping your students' attention. What do you find of this issue?
I think half the battle is getting kids into the classroom. And then, as David said, I really enjoyed how you put that, helping kids find their niche through the classroom. And I think Indonesia is really going ahead of the game in terms of its impact on modern society at the moment. I had numerous conversations this week about Indonesian martial arts films like The Raid, the Pencak Silat in John Wick 3. Then there's the rapper Brian Manuel. Social media is a great one to bring kids in. Jakarta being the most Instagrammed place on earth. I think bringing kids in through there's that great video interview of Chris Hemsworth terribly murdering the Indonesian language. but the kids don't know that, and they can see clearly that that's powerful, that the reaction to him speaking Indonesian was just, I think that's a really great incentive for kids to learn Indonesian. Barack Obama, when he went a few years ago and spoke about bakso and pulang kampung, those are really, really powerful people that are encouraging kids to learn Indonesian. And I think we have all of the ingredients there. It's just bringing it together and getting them into the classroom. And we're never going to compete with Japanese, but we can compete with the others, I think, personally. And I think that we do have all the ingredients there to do that. So yeah.
Just on this point, that there's been a question in the Zoom chat that I might throw to you, Kirrilly. It's about what's the role of Indonesian communities in Australia at the moment joining up to help with, it might be a school event, an open day or something like that. Is that something that's difficult? I'm sure it is an administratively heavy task to do, but what's their role in what you do for teaching your students?
I was actually thinking about this earlier this week. I got into Indonesian teaching through AIYA, and we had created programs for schools that at times have been really successful, other times been chaos. But I think everyone in the community can go to their local school and volunteer, especially if that school doesn't teach Indonesian, go in and offer to talk to the class about Indonesia and spread that knowledge about Indonesian, because they may have it at high school or et cetera, et cetera. And I think that it is very hard for teachers to let outsiders into schools. There's lots of administrative things. There's some states require working with vulnerable people, checks on arrival, even just for our language assistants, which I've been fortunate to live in 2 states which have significant language assistant programs. They have to go through huge administrative things to get into schools. So it can be hard, but keep trying and help teach a cool dance. We had Suara Indonesia at my last school come in, and they did the pocho pocho with these like fun dance moves, and the kids loved it. So bringing in your knowledge, your modern knowledge of Indonesia, but even of the gamelan and the angklung, and bringing that in to the classroom is really helpful to teachers, because teachers are often not experts in all parts of Indonesia. They may know Jakarta, they may know just Bali. So helping bring other parts of Indonesia into the classroom, I think, is definitely worthwhile. So put your hands up, go email I literally, when we were doing it with AIYA, I emailed the Canberra Indonesian Teachers Association, and that's how we got into.
Thanks, Kirrilly.
Like Canberra's obviously a small community as well, so.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to be more active in pulling out questions from the chat. But one of these I picked up from your article, David. It was from the Worsley report, and it talked about, and obviously this is a report from quite some time ago, but it talked about the need to, on a reoccurring basis, have figures. And Paul, you talked about needing hard figures to drive a conversation. And in that report, it talked about not just the number of students, but the quality of their language, whether they were background speakers beforehand. Could you perhaps expand on this idea of figures and stats? What helps drive the conversation? What are good indicators for how we are studying a language? And what should we, if we don't have it already, what should we be looking to record so that we can drive this conversation?
Thanks, Dan. My own view on this is probably a little bit, what should I say, a little bit biased, a little bit one-eyed. I mean, my own view is that this is, at one level, an extremely political process. We those of us who have an interest in making Indonesian available in our education system need to be continually, regularly, passionately lobbying at all levels, our local members, our state representatives, our Commonwealth politicians, ministerial level, to make the point that funding needs to be available, space needs to be made available within curricula, incentives need to be provided both to teaching staff, potential teachers at the various levels, and to students to enable them to go. And to make those political arguments, to do that lobbying, data is really important. We need to be able to show what I believe, what the trends are, how significant is the fall off of interest in these areas, and so that politicians can consider that in the light of the way they calibrate the importance of various international relationships that Australia has and that they fund through foreign affairs, through trade ministries and tourism and all those sorts of programs that they stimulate and fund. So my own view is that collecting that sort of information, whether it's within a particular school, a particular university, or at a national level, that sort of thing is really important. As I think it is important to be able to track what happens to these students when they leave our classrooms. And again, reflecting on my own experience at a tertiary level, it is extremely powerful, I think, to be able to point to where students who have gone through programs like AIYA have gone, what they have done with that experience, how they have transformed and that experience into something which then drives a career or leads them in a particular direction. And that sort of information, again, I think is really important for us to be able to marshal and for us to be able to present and for us to be able to then show to students who are thinking about whether it's worth studying a language, and if they study a language, which language will they study? So having access to that sort of information, I think, is really helpful, is really powerful. And I would say just having somebody like Chris Bowen in national political life who is prepared to say, as a government, as a potential government, we can't tell students, we can't tell business people, we can't tell members of the community, you should be studying Indonesian or an Asian language unless we as politicians are prepared to do that. So he then goes and enrolls as an adult learner, as an online student to do a major in Indonesian studies through UNE in Armidale. Now, I reckon if having a few of those sorts of examples of where people in influence in the public eye are prepared to actually put their time and effort into valuing and to learning Indonesian, I think it's really important for us to be able to point to when we're talking to students and potential students and to parents. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. I'll pivot that one towards you now, Paul. You've tracked the policy changes over the years and the take-up of study. Are there particular markers where we've been more successful than others in promoting the language and getting action from political circles? And if so, what's been the drivers of that?
Yes, it's a difficult question, but important. As I said, in reviewing the last 10 years, I was a lot more positive about what had occurred. And I've already expressed that in terms of, influences on the political process where decisions are made and people see the teaching of Indonesian as important. And we had those outcomes through those various moves, initiatives and institutions which grew over the last 10 years. But I'd go back, maybe, we can look at a previous period around the 60s and 70s, where Indonesian studies was taking off. We also had parallel to that strong cultural influences happening in Australia. Novels such as The Year of Living Dangerously or Monkeys in the Dark. These were books being written with Indonesian backgrounds or stories that were being told. It seemed to be a natural process. It seemed to be part of Australia going, look, we want to look out to the rest of the world, but let's look at our region too, because if we are trying to think about our Australian identity, that's partly formed by the countries which border us. So we want to explore those cultures, and it's part of the unique feature of living here in Australia. And out of that came the films, the books, and the music as well. And so that's why I would point to these particular times. One's a political period in the last 10 years, and another is that cultural period in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s that we perhaps look at more closely to get some clues. It's really hard to identify how these cultural trends build up. It's surprising that when David talks or shows those figures, how the trend down in Indonesian studies occurred nationally. So we know that that's a cultural event. It's not something to do with a bad teacher or a program that was poorly funded. It's a cultural event. So it is fascinating, even though it worries us. So there's something there to learn from the history.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm now going to move to questions. So if anyone has still got questions and they haven't typed into the chat, please feel free to do so. This one's for Paul and David. It's about students returning from an in-country study and finding, perhaps they've completed all the courses they can. That was the case for me. I think ANU only had about 6 or 7 Indonesian language courses. So once I finished all of those, there was nothing left. But in other cases, people come back from an in-country experience and there's nothing there at the university for them to continue that interest which they just sparked. What can be done about that phenomenon? Is there some way we pivot those students away from universities to elsewhere, or is that a poor substitute? We really want them to be gaining that through the university system. Maybe I'll start with you, Paul.
Yeah, look, I've heard of this, and it's a little bit linked also to people going, look, I've studied Indonesian, but what do I do now? And I'd say with our advanced learners, we need to move them out of the purely educational sphere and get them into, real world situations, whether they be in practical areas where they're welcomed into different institutions which have links with Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And this could be business links or political links or cultural links. Somehow we need a collection of willing agencies to bring these people in and use some of their skills that they've just returned with and make them feel useful. There's also independent initiatives that those individuals can take. Just reflecting on one of the other issues that came up was that, look, people want to see whether they got jobs out of studying Indonesian. And that's a sort of double-edged sword. Like, yes, we want them to get jobs, but at the same time, schools and universities are not training people for careers in Indonesian. We're training people to go out and explore the world, to be capable, to be culturally mature, to be able to be flexible. And so, just because, 60 or 70% of our students don't necessarily get jobs using their Indonesian, doesn't mean those programs are failing, or rather we have to make sure that we look very much at the long term.
David, did you have any thoughts to add on that question?
Look, it's a really vexed issue, and one that exercised my mind when I was teaching Indonesian at Murdoch for many years, one of the things that's been characteristic, I think, of university degrees in the last 15 years has been an increasing narrowing of options for students at one level. So initially, when we started sending students to Indonesia for a year as part of their Bachelor of Asian Studies degree, they had a year in country, and they came back and they did an advanced unit on Indonesian interpreting and translating. By that stage, they were essentially fluent in Indonesian, and we were teaching the skills that would then lead them to go out and be able to function as interpreters and translators. That course only survived about 3 years because the numbers at about half a dozen returning students were deemed to be unviable by the university, and so those courses were closed. So we ended up with a situation where students did return. They were, after a period of study in country, already at the level that graduating students would be. Essentially, unless they then were able to go into an honours program or some other postgraduate preparation, some masters in interpreting and translating or something of that kind, there weren't any subsequent programs they could do. Very few universities teach units of study for advanced Indonesian. There are very few courses on Indonesian linguistics, Indonesian literature, for example. I don't know what the answer is, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I think one hopes that by the time a student has got to that level of linguistic competence, they are able to then self-direct their engagement with Indonesian speakers in a way that sustains and stimulates and maintains their language capability, that they then offer themselves to the employment market with that as one of the skills that they bring to whatever job they apply for. But I must say it is disappointing to feel that universities don't really offer courses to students who are coming back with those level of skills.
Thanks, David. I'm going to move this one now to you, Kirrilly. It's a question about, I guess, the promotion by universities to high school students about their Indonesian programs. And I think you've got a unique experience coming from the ACT, where you'd be very close to the ANU, and then also now in Victoria. There aren't TV ads promoting these things. There's probably not social media ads either. I've seen flyers every now and again, which are usually made by high school teachers to help their kids aggregate some information. Have you seen any universities stepping up in this space? And if not, as a teacher, what do you think is needed?
So I'm not quite sure in the Victorian context, but coming from the ACT context, when colleges, which are year 11 and 12 schools in the ACT, were dropping Indonesian quite rapidly, the ANU set up an extension program for year 11 and 12 students. So they get a subject accredited to their year 12 certificate from the ANU. And what this has done with Zara has created a really clear stepping stone into university level Indonesian. And I think that that program has expanded. So I think they're almost at capacity at the moment for the Indonesian class ANU. It's also opened up Indonesian to schools that don't offer Indonesian, to students at schools that don't offer Indonesian. So they're able to still join in the Indonesian course at the ANU. It's not language-based. It is often political, but it goes into some really interesting parts of Indonesia and draws students into the ANU. The ANU also offer 5 bonus points if you study an Asian language to get into ANU. I know in Victoria that there's a system of 5 bonus points which somehow gets worked out. I think that universities can do more to help schools get students into their programs. I think that We see it at the Year 9 level where Indonesian becomes an elective subject and it's competing against those art subjects that's where kids drop off. And so I think that, but that's also where kids are starting to think about the future and thinking about their careers and things like that. So I think that universities have a huge opportunity to step in and help schools get there. I think that the ACT is, that was a really great example from the ACT. I'm not sure what's happening elsewhere around the country, but yeah, the ANU works quite closely with the schools, and we would have Zara come in and talk to the students, and that was a really great motivator for those students to keep going. I saw Ellie Williams just wrote how a kid's going on, and I think it's through that ANU program that they're going on, because often they can't continue doing Indonesian because they have to do biology and physics and all of those types of things, because as I said earlier, the kids that are continuing Indonesian are often high achievers, which means that their subjects are jammed packed. So the ANU course was a really good motivator for lower students to keep going with Indonesian. Yeah.
Thanks, Kirrilly. We are drawing.
Sorry, Dan, could I just jump in there? There's been a little bit of kind of communication on the chat lines on how what kind of methods could be used to promote Indonesian, both in schools and universities. And Annie Pullman, for example, was saying that there are all sorts of barriers being put in front of university departments that want to promote Indonesian in year 12 and year 11. I would like to throw out the challenge, in a sense, that social media seems to me to be well, not the only way, but a very significant way of getting Indonesian as a potential in front of students at whatever level of the education system they're at. Things like Realise Indo, is it? The film competition, the video competition, videos being made by students who are Australian students who are in Indonesia, getting those sort of circulated around. But individual Indonesian departments at universities, at programs, often, as Paul said, only a single staff member, just don't have the budget to actually produce material that goes into schools to try to attract students. It would be wonderful if the Indonesian government funded generic videos that could be used, YouTube videos that could be used to promote the language. That could be then circulated, employed, distributed, pointed to by all of us. But it's really difficult to actually get through that marketing process when the budgets are significantly dominated by large disciplines, large programs.
Thank you, David. I'm conscious of the time, and I would encourage the panelists, because you seem all very well aware of the chat. If you'd like to type out any answers before you leave, please feel free to. But what I might do is just wrap up with some comments from each of you. I think particularly we've got a lot of really active and interested people watching today, and some of them are educators, some of them are students, some of them are just interested in the relationship. And the answer obviously isn't that we all do one thing. The answer is that we all do different things, and we engage the community in different ways. So from each of you, what's your reflection on what would be the thing that you'd want someone to take away from this talk and put into action so that we can help improve the rate of study of Indonesian in Australia? I might start with Paul.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Yes, wow. That's very tricky, but look, I'll take up one of the comments from, I think it's Erin McMahon was talking about the role of Indonesian government, asked a question about the role of Indonesian government. I think that when we look at the limited resources that we have, we need to really build up that cooperation with Indonesia, with the Indonesian government. we are in a competition with other languages, which maybe is a little bit awkward. But when we look at the support that the Koreans or the Japanese or the Chinese are getting from their governments in the programs, we can't help but turn to Indonesia and say there and see whether we can look at ways in which we can further the development of Indonesian language in cooperation with Indonesia. I was at the Badan Bahasa in Jakarta in January, and they are interested in BIPA, the teaching of Indonesian as a foreign language, and they have people there. But at the moment, there still seems to be a disconnect with the way they're devoting their resources to developing units or developing materials, which don't necessarily dovetail with what we need here in Australia. And they ask the question, why aren't people using these resources? And really, you know, it was difficult to give a clear response to them because they are enthusiastic, but somehow we haven't got that dialogue going. I mean, I thought we did, you know, that it would have developed by this stage, but that's the interesting thing that we still need that dialogue with people, you know, in the Badan Bahasa and who are enthusiastic about the teaching of Indonesian as a foreign language. I think that's an area for priority.
Thanks, Paul. Kirrilly, any last observations?
I guess I think that as from the school system, we need to be looking towards those schools that have built up successful Indonesian programs and are maintaining numbers and encouraging students to keep going with Indonesian and replicate that across the country. I think also we need to rally state governments. Education in schools is a state government responsibility, and if state governments aren't on board, then schools can't be on board. So I think that's really important as well. So definitely lobbying state governments as well. In Victoria, we see how successful the Indonesian program is here, and the Victorian government are extremely supportive of Indonesian, whereas in the ACT government has very limited knowledge of the impact of Indonesia. They just went to Jakarta last year and didn't really know what they were getting themselves into, all the opportunity that Indonesia promoted. So I think lobbying state governments and looking towards those successful Indonesian programs will be really important going forward in increasing Indonesian numbers in schools and successfully in universities as well.
Thanks, Kirrilly. David, you've got the last word.
Oh, what a responsibility. Look, I would underline what Kirrilly and Paul have both said. To extend Kirrilly's comments a little, I think each one of us participating today will be conscious of particular spheres of influence that we might have. It might be in our local primary school, it might be in our high school, it might be within a local community group. We might have links with local members of parliament. We might be involved in business groups. I can see various people who represent those sorts of interests in our list of attendees. And we need to be constantly bringing Indonesian language to the forefront of our conversations at those times. This is a particularly pressing time nationally because I fear that the current circumstances around the pandemic mean that the national government will shift its gaze from Indonesia, shift its focus within programs like the new Colombo Plan, away from Indonesia to the Pacific. And I think we need to be, if we want opportunities to be there for our students to actually get to Indonesia safely, we've got to be able to maintain funding for those sorts of programs. And we have to maintain an infrastructure which enables our students at universities, hopefully from schools as well, to go and spend some time in Indonesia. That's going to be very difficult over the next 12 to 18 months, but I think it's really important. So don't underestimate the value of sitting down and writing a letter to your local Member of Parliament, writing a letter to your local school principal, having a chat to them. And I would say, just in concluding, by your membership of AIYA and by networking through these sorts of linkages, you are actually already making the point of the importance of Indonesia and the value and experience and competence in that language has going forward into your careers. So thank you for that.
Thank you, David. On behalf of AIYA, we're very appreciative for everyone who's come to watch, and obviously our panelists for presenting. I should also say that we've branched out a little bit. I know that not everyone in the chat here is probably our target audience of 18 to 35. And that's really wonderful. We do want to be connecting with others. I think afterwards there will be a feedback form. And we really want to know if there's ways that we as young Australians and Indonesians can engage with you in whatever sphere of influence you have. We want to hear it, and it might be that we do more events like this. I think it's been a great success. So thank you once again to everyone. Sampai jumpa.
Sampai jumpa.